A war veteran saluted a royal guard. His response left everyone in tears. The afternoon sun hung low over Buckingham Palace, casting long golden rays across the cobblestone courtyard. The grand iron gates stood tall and unshaken, just as they had for centuries, a symbol of Britain's unwavering strength and history. Tourists moved in waves, their excited voices blending into a chorus of awe and admiration. Some pointed at the majestic architecture, while others adjusted their cameras to capture the legendary royal guards, men known not just for their discipline, but for their ability to remain still, no matter what. And yet, amidst the sea of visitors, a single man stood apart. He was 85 years old, yet his posture, though weighed by time, carried a distinct dignity. His navy blue military coat, though faded, was immaculately pressed. But what truly set him apart were the rows of polished medals gleaming on his chest, each one a silent testament to battles fought, sacrifices made, and years of unwavering service. Beside him, his 12-year-old grandson walked in quiet admiration, his small fingers gripping the old man's hand. He had always known his grandfather was special, but here, standing among guards, tourists, and history itself, he truly felt it. "Grandpa," the boy finally asked, his voice filled with wonder, "are they real soldiers?" Arthur Reynolds, a Royal Navy veteran, let out a soft chuckle, his weathered hands tightening around the cane he barely used. "Aye, lad," he murmured, nodding slowly. "They're real. And they stand here, just as we once did." His gaze locked onto one of the guards, a young soldier in his mid-20s, standing firm, rifle in hand, his uniform immaculate, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his towering bearskin hat. As they stepped forward, the crowd instinctively parted, sensing something different about this moment. This was not just another tourist passing by. This was a soldier returning to honor another. Then, with measured precision, Arthur released his cane, squared his shoulders as best he could, and, with trembling but unwavering determination, raised his right hand in a perfect salute. For a long moment, nothing happened. The royal guard remained motionless, his gaze fixed forward. His rifle rested in his hands, his back as straight as the very history he stood to protect. Arthur's hand remained raised, despite the subtle shake of age. His chest, adorned with medals that told stories of war, rose and fell in steady breaths. The crowd, which had been alive with conversation, fell into an unnatural silence. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her cheek. A young soldier in the crowd stiffened, recognizing the unspoken weight of what was unfolding. Even palace security personnel, trained to observe and not interfere, took a step closer. This was not just a salute. This was a bridge across time. A moment where the past and present, two generations of soldiers, stood face to face. And yet, the royal guard did not move. Because he couldn't. His discipline was absolute. He had been trained to stand his ground, to remain stoic, no matter the distraction. And yet, something in his eyes changed. Though his face remained unreadable, his gaze shifted ever so slightly, taking in the man before him. He saw the deep lines on his face, the decorated uniform, the weight of decades of service. He saw who stood before him. Still, he did not move. The silence stretched. Arthur's arm began to ache, but he held his salute steady. The young royal guard stood firm, but his breathing subtly slowed. The crowd held their breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A man in his 40s, wearing a veteran's lapel pin, murmured, if he were allowed, he'd salute back. A woman beside him whispered, "I've never seen a moment like this." Though the royal guard remained still, there was something different now. Attention, not from defiance, but from understanding. His eyes traced the medals, reading the history behind them, recognizing battles long past, sacrifices made before he was even born. He wasn't just looking at a tourist. He was looking at a soldier. And then, he moved. With flawless precision, the royal guard lifted his white-gloved hand. And he saluted back. The crowd gasped, the sound of pure disbelief and admiration rolling through them like a wave. The salute was crisp, firm, executed with the discipline of a soldier, but it was more than that. It was respect. It was honor. It was one soldier recognizing another. For the briefest of moments, Arthur's lips trembled, his eyes welling up with emotion. He lowered his hand slowly, taking in the weight of what had just happened. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something only the guard could hear. "Thank you, lad." The royal guard lowered his own salute, his face unreadable, but his message clear. The salute lasted only a few seconds, but in that short time, it carried a weight far heavier than words could express. The royal guard, standing as firm as ever, slowly lowered his hand, returning to his unshakable stance. His rifle remained at his side, his posture immaculate, as though nothing had changed. But everyone who had witnessed the exchange knew the truth. Something had changed. The moment was not scripted. It was not a tourist attraction or a mere coincidence. It was a silent promise, exchanged between two men of duty, one standing at the beginning of his journey, the other nearing the end of his. Arthur lowered his own salute, his aged hand trembling ever so slightly. His lips, thin and weathered, parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. Because in this moment, words were unnecessary. Instead, he simply gave a small nod, his eyes locking onto the royal guard's face, or at least, the part of it visible beneath his bearskin hat. A quiet understanding passed between them. A moment of respect, of gratitude, of shared sacrifice. Arthur's grandson, who had been watching with wide, fascinated eyes, gripped his grandfather's hand tighter. "Grandpa?" he whispered, his voice barely audible against the murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "Did he really salute back?" Arthur let out a soft exhale, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his emotions. "Aye, lad," he murmured, his voice thick. "He did." A single tear escaped his aged eyes, rolling down the deep lines on his face. Not from sadness, but from pride. The crowd, which had remained silent in awe, finally reacted. Soft claps began to ripple through the onlookers, at first hesitant, then growing into a full applause. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply stood in solemn respect. A few veterans in the crowd, recognizing the significance of what had happened, saluted quietly, a tribute from one brotherhood to another. As the applause continued, Arthur let out a slow breath, allowing himself to take in the moment. He had come here expecting nothing. He had simply wanted to stand before the new generation of soldiers, to acknowledge their service the way he had once been acknowledged decades ago. But he had received something more. Something he never expected. His grandson, still clinging to his hand, looked up at him with newfound admiration. "Grandpa," the boy said, his voice filled with pure wonder. "You were a soldier too, right?" Arthur let out a chuckle, soft and deep, the kind that only comes from a lifetime of memories. "Aye, lad," he said again. "I was." The boy's small hand reached toward his grandfather's medals, touching them carefully as if they held some ancient magic. "Did they ever salute you back then?" the boy asked. Arthur's eyes twinkled with a mix of nostalgia and wisdom. "No," he said simply. "Back then, lad, we didn't salute for show. We saluted for those who never came home." The boy's gaze softened. Though he was young, something inside him shifted in that moment. It was no longer just a salute. It was no longer just a moment in time. It was a lesson, a memory that would live on long after they had left Buckingham Palace. Arthur turned one last time, his eyes returning to the royal guard who had saluted him. He wanted to say something more, to express the depth of what had just happened. But he knew, deep down, it was not needed. Because the message had already been given. Respect. Honor. Duty. These were values that transcended time. He gave one final nod, a silent farewell from an old soldier to a young one. Then, gripping his grandson's hand tightly, he turned away. As Arthur walked slowly through the crowd, people instinctively stepped aside, not out of courtesy, but out of reverence. Even as they left the gates of Buckingham Palace, the applause continued behind them, echoing through the courtyard. And as the royal guard stood still once more, returning to his unshaken duty, he knew that he had made a difference today. Not by breaking rules. Not by defying orders. But by acknowledging a fellow soldier. A moment so simple, yet so powerful, that it would be remembered for a lifetime.